So we have it's a relatively minor little blip, but interesting in sort of a meta way. We have Bank of America releasing a report, sort of bullish on Solana, saying, we'll have a discussion about exactly what this means, but saying Solana could be the Visa of the digital asset world. I mean, it's interesting because it's a bank reporting on a crypto thing, and then it is also interesting because they get a little bit into some of the design trade-offs in Solana versus Ethereum. But Zach, we were talking about this before the show. You want to jump in with your thoughts here first?
I mean, I just think it's crazy to see in 2022 Bank of America research analysts talking about Solana, talking about Luna. We're going to see all sorts of like weird things that are being talked about by these Wall Street titans, and I'm still not used to it. We probably should be used to it at this time, but it's just striking to see them talk about this stuff. And I think again, the security trade-offs are mentioned, but also sort of the still nascent and somewhat experimental nature of these chains should be mentioned if it's not mentioned in this report, right? Solana has been hit with a number of sort of like degraded performance situations over the last few weeks, where transactions are either stalled or choked up, and it doesn't always weigh on the price of this asset, but it certainly weighs on the ability for people to use these chains as they are intended to be used for financial applications that exist in a more decentralized fashion. So hope that's in there. I don't know if they got to that, but definitely worth mentioning when you look at, okay, it could be Visa one day, but recently it's a bit it's moving a bit choppily, and Solana has been hit with some degraded performance issues of late. So definitely worth mentioning that. But I'll toss it back down to you.
I saw Jen wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I have a question for you, David. Did you take a look at the research behind this research note? Because it felt like in the article when I was reading it, it was like a lot of information that we already know about Solana. And I would have loved to see if they compared Solana against other chains and what they took into account, because it seemed like in the article that they had spoken to someone from the Solana Foundation and said, okay, Solana could be the next Visa. But what did they compare Solana against?
So I was not able to find the original research report. Sometimes these have limited distribution, and you have to sort of reach out and get them, and I didn't have time for that. But there was, the main comparison point seemed to be Ethereum. And they did talk about the scaling versus centralization trade-off, which, for people who aren't familiar, I'm going to speak in sort of broad terms here, but Solana has fewer validators and less sort of open participation in the validation process, as far as I understand it, than Ethereum and other design choices that can make it more vulnerable, but make it faster and give it more transaction speed. I'm not sure what other comparisons they were making, but what I'm interested in as well is, what's the business model for B of A to be commenting on this? I think to some extent it's just about like making sure they're staying relevant in the discussion, but also they are advising investors who are making choices. And I have to echo kind of what Zach said, that in some ways, I mean, we had Fidelity commenting on this stuff as far back as 2017, 2018. So these major players have been transitioning in for a while. But it does feel strange, especially because these things are so speculative and frankly so early in a lot of ways, that in some ways it almost feels like Bank of America is getting ahead of themselves in other places, and maybe even endangering investors to a certain extent by not emphasizing, because Zach, to my knowledge, they did not talk about the breakdowns. The other big thing that I saw was missing from at least the summaries was any discussion of whether Solana might be a security that could be intervened with by the SEC or something like that. That still feels like a somewhat unresolved question. But I saw somebody wanted to chime in. Yes, go for it, Naomi.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So Solana is a little bit different to Ethereum in that they co-locate their servers. So it's one of the ways that they can get things really fast and efficient is that because all of their machines like in the same place. So that's why a lot of people say, well, this is more centralized and we should have things geographically dispersed. If someone just wanted to shut off the internet to a country or just like a particular area, then that poses a risk to the system. So there are legitimate concerns there. I mean, it gets back to functionality as well. well, though. And it's this age-old trade-off that we keep talking about in crypto. Moxie Marlinspike, the former CEO of Signal, had this great post the other day where he's talking about Web3 and how centralized is it really? And he kind of gets to the heart of this issue, this idea that we talk about these decentralized systems, but they tend to be pretty centralized. So we should be aware of that. I mean, I actually really I think there's a big role for centralization in a lot of this stuff because it does get eliminate a lot of friction. It makes things easier. We've seen that it's helped with scalability, and there's a lot more congestion on Ethereum. But you guys have brought up actually there's been some issues with Solana as well. So maybe it hasn't completely solved those problems. But the issue of centralization really is a big one when it comes to an asset that governments fundamentally do not like and want to shut down. And we've proven this throughout history that the government will go after competing currencies as large as possible. So the government throughout history has gone after any competing currencies and shut them down because they can, because they've always had a central point of failure. And the reason that Bitcoin was this incredible revolution was it was the first time in history we had a competing currency that couldn't be shut down because it was decentralized. And now we're going back into this hybrid world of, let's have some trade-offs there and let's add more functionality and ease of use. And yes, that brings more people into the camp, which is super important. We want as many people as possible involved with these alternative systems, but it does pose a centralization point of failure, and that is a real risk. So I agree with you, David, and Steve the cat, who I see has joined us on the chat.
Yeah, we have a fifth host.
A fifth host, lot to say. Something he agrees. Something is very fishy going on here. But I think, sorry, that's terrible pun. But I do think that there is a it's definitely something to keep in mind, this centralization of what trade-offs we are making and whether or not the SEC does indeed deem this to be a security. Like, there are a lot of big questions there. If we're creating competing systems, we want them to be as robust as possible so they can't be targeted by people who don't like them. So just something to keep in mind.